Welcome to the Health System CIO show. I'm your host, founder, and editor, Anthony Guerra. On today's episode, I'll be speaking with Dr. Brian Dilcher, Associate CMIO and Director of Emergency Medicine Clinical Informatics at WVU Medicine. Dr. Dilcher, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Anthony.
All right, great. You want to start off by telling me a little bit about your organization and your role?
Yeah, sure. WVU Medicine is an integrated academic health system operating in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Ohio. A couple clinics in Virginia as well. We see, and from the emergency department perspective, well over 600,000 visits a year across all of our departments. And yeah, now they're into the payer space as well with the health plan, peak health, in addition to the clinical operations.
Excellent. And Associate CMIO, just as you answer this question about title, I've been thinking a lot about physician builders. A lot of mostly in Epic, but I mean, you could have physician builders in Meditech, in Oracle/Cerner. At least from my perception, this seems to be a rising role, extremely important and on the ascendancy, as it were. So I'd like your thoughts. Tell me a little bit about your role as Associate CMIO, and then just your overall thoughts on this physician builder role that seems to, like I said, be sort of becoming more prominent.
Yeah, absolutely. As associate CMIO, I am responsible for informatics work throughout our emergency departments, predominantly. That is kind of the interface between the technical side and the clinical side, and I think of myself sometimes as the translator between the two languages, from the tech forward aspect and then the clinical aspect as well. And I think that kind of lends itself really well to your follow-up question, that and why the builder role has become more and more important, as systems get more complicated. Both the operation side plus the technology as well. You need those people that understand both sides of the door, essentially, right? And are able to, you know, basically take the clinical needs, translate that to the technical part, either building it themselves or at least have a deep understanding of the system so that they can communicate that to the build teams that are in place, to help move care along for our patients and our clinicians.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, you have the titles, the CMIO title, Associate CMIO title. Um, Beyond that, do you have any thoughts around what kind of sort of volume you need? And I know this is completely dependent on the size of your health system, whatever metrics you want to put on that would define size. I'm just wondering how many people you need in those roles, or do you need as many as you can get? Do you need to have a few formal titles, but then you want your physician builder community that lives under that to be as robust as possible? Are they formalized in any way other than getting some certifications? Do they need to have FTE a couple hours a week,
Right.
couple hours a month, whatever it is? And then as a follow-up to that, let's say you're a CMIO at a health system and you want to cultivate that, you want to grow out your physician builder community. Um, how do you do that? How do you identify who's interested, who might be interested? And sort of, it seems like something that is very important to develop.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think, we're still learning, as well. Dr. Dave Rich is our CMIO. There's three of us underneath him that are associate that kind of have system-wide responsibility. Then with our we have 25 hospitals, going to be soon 31. Um, there's regional associates or assistant CMIOs kind of in the different regions that the hospitals fund. I think a lot of it depends on the structure of the organization. But I think having like a good base structure of a CMIO and then like a report structure to that person, and then like you said, the people that aren't maybe as interested in the leadership side of it and just want to kind of be able to help, themselves, their fellow clinicians, the patients, having opportunities to pursue those physician builder roles, The most important part about it, though, is being able to show the value to either the individual departments or the practice plans to be able to protect some of their time so that they can be effective builders. Because, at least for myself, when I started out started as a physician builder and got really interested into the additional leadership opportunities, but I was doing work essentially for free to prove my worth, to be able to then ask for that time to be protected and show the value. And I think as programs mature, that will be kind of more known that there is value in doing that. But that's kind of part of the growing pains that we've at least experienced of trying to, to show the worth of the physician builder role. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. There may be some individuals who want to build simply to solve the problems they're confronting in their own workflow and not interested perhaps in much other else than that. I see a problem. I'm pretty good with this stuff. I like it. I want to fix my problem. That could work depending again on we're going to talk about what Epic's got going on with the agent factory. That could work perhaps in certain situations, but I could also see a scenario where you say we don't really want that per se, except in certain ways. We're looking for more of a formalized process where um, problems are identified that are at least department wide, perhaps system wide, and you can build for that. We don't want you building for one-offs. Um, and then we have differentiated workflows and different. I don't know. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, and I think that kind of all goes back to the your change control process, and the governance around changes. Our physician builders get access to be able to build things. All that building is in a non-production environment that still requires different checks and testing before it would ever even make it into production. So, while yes, there's some people out there that potentially would say, "Hey, this is my problem that I need to solve for myself." Maybe there are more people that problem would solve, right? Like by somebody maybe not so altruistically making changes to improve their own workflow, may incidentally improve others as well. But again, it has to go through that whole change control process even to make it into a production environment. So there's lots of checks and balances to kind of keep that from happening, and that's something that we do internally before people even go down the process of becoming a physician builder. We do a little bit of, not super thorough vetting, but at least try to get the why behind, what the individual wants to get out of it, what problems that they think they might want to solve, et cetera, and kind of put them through. Epic has a smart user program, or they call it, yeah, smart user now, used to be power user. So they kind of go through that program first, and then if they, still continue to want to build and they have they're dedicated to do it, then that at that point go through the physician builder program and become part of our team. We have monthly checkpoints and talk and discussions and stuff like that as well. So to try to get them the tools they need to be able to build, and then also kind of keep in touch on what projects are going on and everything as well.
Yeah, it's interesting as things are evolving and moving along, the complexity required to build is going down, right? So you could have individuals that would be interested in this as a concept, but maybe we're not interested in coding, pure coding. And they say that's just not for me. That's a little too technical. But I want to build, but I want the blocks. I want to build with blocks. I don't want to build with sand, or right? I don't want to be that granular. So the appeal has changed, perhaps. So someone who wasn't interested before now might be interested because it's more of a building blocks with the agent factory. So it's almost like you need to resurface what's possible, and you may get people who weren't interested before. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, potentially. I think there's still some underlying knowledge that's required versus just kind of moving things around and piecing them together. Because if you don't understand the data structure in the background, you're still going to struggle to get the right pieces in the right places, even with the
Uh-huh.
kind of drag and drop interface. And again, it's still a fluid product too. They haven't committed any release dates or anything like that. So we had the Agent Factory Build-a-thon was essentially a development preview, and kind of a real world test for Epic. But yeah, so
Just very interesting. I have a good analogy. I use WordPress for our website, and they have something called Beaver Builder. So I have a guy who does not work for me formally. He's sort of part-time, and he does the WordPress back end stuff. He put Beaver Builder on, which is a sort of a blocks. You pull the blocks on, and you could. So I'm good with that. I can pull blocks around, but anytime you throw the word code out, like I email him, I'm done. Put code in here, change this code. I'm so afraid of breaking something
Right.
that I'm just out. But I can pull blocks around. So I don't know if that's a good analogy to Agent Factory, where you can pull some blocks around, but like you mentioned, if you don't know the underlying code going on, you can very easily hit your wall of knowledge and want to tap out.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, if you don't understand that background, data structure, like, you may be pulling something you think is pulling the right stuff, but ultimately it's not the right item that you're looking for. You don't necessarily have to know the code per se, but at least know, that this hook is looking to this piece of the data structure, to with this table, this column in the database, to get you the knowledge, or the information that you're looking for to be able to even pass it through to an agent, or do anything else. The other thing that we found in the group that I worked with, at the Build-a-thon, was you have to have a pretty deep understanding as well of how AI and large language models work in terms
Hmm.
of the token cost, and the input tokens, output tokens. They are transparent as you kind of build and you run your testing, in the Agent Factory. But like there, for example, we had a couple different members of the group. One was a data scientist, data engineer. The other was a physician, not myself, one of the other physicians in our group. But the prompting that the two used, were vastly different. The engineer was very efficient prompt, only used 20,000 input tokens, versus the physician wasn't really thinking about that per se,
Uh-huh.
and burned 250,000 input tokens on a single run of the flow. So, that's the thing I think that organizations are going to have to for sure keep tabs on, is as you're building these, maybe a physician, or not a like super, maybe not a data engineer has to build every one, but at least they need to look over all of them and kind of go through the analysis of, like, where we can gain efficiencies in this flow versus just dumping everything into a model. Because it will work, it's just going to be very expensive, once you blow through that many tokens on a single patient run. So
That's absolutely fascinating. It really is, how this is going to evolve. Help me understand. Is when we're talking about using Epic's Agent Factory, when we talk about tokens, are those being charged per se, as we say, by an underlying large LLM like Claude or GPT or Gemini? So is that where we talk about token costs? They're coming from those entities, not from Epic?
that's my understanding, current state, that it would be basically cost passed back to the customer, that Epic incurs by running stuff on the model that they had in the build environment that we were working in, was ChatGPT 5.1, so OpenAI. And I think they plan to expand other models from what was said. But, yeah, that would be the cost per million tokens, essentially, is, I think, the industry standard of how they're charged. And you could go through a million tokens pretty fast if you're not careful with the way you're prompting.
Currently, can you pick the LLM that's going to be underlaying the work that you're going to do through Epic Agent Factory?
At least with what we saw, again, the development preview, they only had, OpenAI models,
Hmm.
but there were different models throughout that OpenAI had. And I think my understanding of what they said the plan was, it would to be expand at that point from there. But, in the test environment that we were using, it was just OpenAI at the moment.
So we've heard stories. I don't know if you've seen these in the general media. I don't know if they're apocryphal or if they're true, about people burning through crazy amounts of tokens and their allotment for the year in 3 months at a company. Um, but what you mentioned, and you used the words effectiveness and efficiency, which are not the same thing, right? So you
Sure.
can have an effective prompt. You can both get to the same point, but one can use a tremendously larger amount of tokens. That's not a victimless crime. That really is going to matter and add up. So, you can be good at working an agent factory and effect, but you can be very inefficient at it, and you need to get better. Like it's not going to be good enough to burn through high amounts of tokens. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, and the one thing we've talked about a little bit since we went and came back and kind of digested, what we saw and kind of think about our plan going forward is, not only the efficiency of the token cost, but like, even just in the R&D phase of this, you may put forth a significant amount of effort, even though it's much simpler to build a flow using the agent factory, but ultimately you may build something out, the requester changes their mind at the end. Now even just doing this testing, you've already spent X number of tokens
Hmm.
just to even try to get a product up and running. So I think that's something that folks are going to have to think about as they move forward down these new tools. Is you're budgeting for R&D of stuff, and knowing that maybe this product or this flow that's being developed doesn't ultimately end up going into production and doesn't ultimately end up amounting to anything, but being able to eat that R&D cost and have the flexibility to move from it and move to something else.
Yeah, so you talk about the dynamic of building something and then being told never mind.
Right.
And then, so that can't happen without being recorded and understood, and what happened and how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Why did we get a never mind? Did we approve something that we shouldn't have approved? Maybe it's going to happen once in a while. It simply is going to happen, but it should be the exception.
Sure. And well, even just doing a proof of concept on an idea that is approved, right? Like just even setting up a proof of concept, you're going to be potentially spending, thousands, hundreds of thousands of tokens using an agent through the LLM as you refine the prompts, as you refine different things. So that's what I'm saying in terms, and then maybe you find out that it doesn't actually achieve the goal that you originally sought out to achieve, and you may just have to, cut your losses at that point and move on to a different workflow or something like that. So
This is totally fascinating to me. I'm thinking of like the free estimate you get when you want a home repair or something. So you say, "Come on out. I'm thinking about getting my roof done or doing this or that," and they give you an estimate, and you say yes or no. So, someone, let's say in your scenario, there could be a request from operations that, "Hey, we would like this done. We'd like to be able to do this," and you say, "Okay, we're going to give you an estimate." This is just how many tokens we think it'll cost to do this, and they may say yes or no based on how many tokens maybe they have in their token budget for the year.
sure.
Right, people usually have a dollar budget. They're going to have token budgets. Everybody's going to have a token budget, and you decide what you want to spend your tokens on. And sometimes there's overages when you get an estimate for your house and they say, "Hey, halfway through, oh, we're having trouble sourcing these tiles you wanted. Your estimate's going to be higher." Well, never mind. So it just gets really into interesting areas that I don't think have been part of the flow
Right.
before.
Yeah, definitely not. I think it's a new frontier for sure for healthcare IT.
Yeah, so you're just working through this one instance at a time. I guess we want to make sure we don't hit any catastrophes. We don't want those to be in the news for having blown through 2 million tokens by accident, right?
Right.
So
Exactly.
that's where you talk about the governance, right? Let's get the governance in. So we'll get it improved over time, but let's try and avoid any catastrophes by putting in some basic governance. And that's what you said in your post. So tell me what you're thinking when you talk about governance in this. What kind of bodies are they require? New entities, like new committees that currently don't exist? You mentioned things going through AI governance. AI governance is fairly new. That's an interesting topic of how that either is a new committee, but also dovetails occasionally with existing committees, and where does it dovetail and where does it not? That's fascinating stuff. But are we talking about now any new committees that you're thinking of, or can we work within existing committees?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can go within existing committees if they exist at individual organizations of AI governance, because this is ultimately AI governance, through and through. It's just maybe the approach is a little different. A lot of historically, at least in my experience, AI governance has been like, hey, there's this product that's available. This is the cost. These are how many patients this potentially could affect. This is the ROI of this product, and it's a very analytical and scorecard based decision, and then a thumbs up, thumbs down, we're going to pursue this or not, or we're going to try to maybe develop something similar internally, etc. But yeah, I think with the Agent Factory, it's going to be, the possibilities are endless of what you can build with it. So it's going to be a lot more of like an idea that comes, and then the AI governance team may decide like, hey, Agent Factory is the best and most efficient way to build this, or we already have something that kind of does this, right? And we just repurpose or retool. And then once you have an inventory of agents through Agent Factory or flows, some of those can be repurposed or broadened to potentially incorporate things. And I think even you probably have to have checkpoints kind of as you go, and recurrent evaluations of these flows. Where you have one that's in production every 6 months, 12 months, whatever the cadence ends up being. You look at it critically, look at how many tokens it's using. Because the other thing that was kind of brought to light is when the language models that are attached to these flows change, the prompt essentially needs to be re-engineered as well. Because if you're using a prompt that was built on 5.1 and now you're running 5.5, that token cost, or the token usage may be significantly different between the two models. So there's going to be ongoing maintenance of all this, I think, as well. And I think having a governance committee is going to be imperative to be able to analyze that. Maybe it's a subcommittee of a governance committee, et cetera. But I don't think I haven't figured out the structure. We haven't figured out the specific structure. I think we're going to have to get the tools in place first, and then kind of keep being agile with the governance and reevaluating what we're doing, and continuing to think forward.
Yeah, and I think that's it, being agile, right? Because there is no defined playbook for this. It's figure it out as you go, but you have to go. You can't not go. You can't just sit back and wait if you want to be a leading organization. Certainly mid-tier community health systems can wait and watch and be what we call fast followers. But for an organization like yours, you're not interested in being fast followers. You're interested in figuring this out as we go, right? I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. That's pretty much the approach that we've kind of adopted and taken.
You mentioned this concept, which is a really interesting one, of it almost makes me think of like building a house on a fault line or sand, with these models changing underneath the workflows we've built, to where the prompt, everything was set. It was all set. It was working beautifully, but the models are going to change underneath. Is there a way to pin what you're doing to a model and to not have it random, the sort of the ground move from underneath you? But the challenge with that, right, is you're pinned to a perhaps dead or static, or it's finished.
Right.
New iterations are coming out, getting better and better, and you're pinned to an old one. It's almost like software updates. So your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, based on my experience, again, still limited information as to how it's going to work in the wild, but you select in your agent chunk of the flow, you select which model that you wanted to run on. That's set as long as that model is still supported by OpenAI or whatever, right? And then if a new model comes out and becomes available, you would have to consciously go in and change it.
Okay.
It's not like it's going to be swept out from underneath you, but
Okay.
anytime you make a change to the model, you do have to, again, look at the prompt, because that will, behave differently on different models. So it would, again, have to be a conscious choice to switch it. And
Okay.
again, unless it's like a deprecated model that's no longer even going to be working, right? So I think that's, they had like the 4.0, they had all the older 4 point whatever versions available to be selected. So sometimes maybe if you're not doing a super complex task, it may be more efficient from a token perspective to use an older model
Ah.
versus using the cutting edge most recent release that's going to potentially use more tokens from that perspective. So it's there again. I think just trying to test and adjust and keep that in mind, that you're going to have to reevaluate and before you just automatically switch over to newer, bigger, better things.
Very good. Let's talk a little bit about so we're talking about building, sort of building it, and you can define building in any number of ways, but we're talking about Epic Agent Factory. So, traditionally we've had a few choices when it comes to new application requests that come up from operations. Usually, I'm speaking to the CIOs and the CMIOs about new requests that come in. That's one of the biggest ways that uh, sort of decision points come to light in IT. Um, we seem to be a couple ways. We see, are we gonna, you know, are we gonna get this at all? Is this something we need? Do we have it? Right. First, we got to figure out, do we have it? Do we have it in our current tool set with our major EMR vendor? Is it available? If not, we look at the niche solutions, the one-offs. And you mentioned this, the idea of FHIR API integration and how you don't have that with Epic Agent Factory, which is a big benefit. You don't have to deal with that. It's in there, it's natively in there. But traditionally, if you are going to use a niche solution, you're going to have to integrate and that could be a challenge or have some limitations. So you've got your buy in suite, buy niche. You had a build option, but now it seems like build option is going to have two options. You could have a pure ground up build, which is almost like, building your own piece of software and then integrating it. Now you've got sort of a build light, which would be an Epic Agent Factory type build where you're using the blocks again. So, just your thoughts, a little bit of your thoughts on sort of the pure build, if that's something you guys ever did, versus the Agent Factory type build.
Yeah, no, so I personally haven't done, because similar to what you said, when you start talking about Python coding and different things, that's a little outside my wheelhouse. But our data scientist that was with me in Wisconsin for the build-a-thon, he has built some ground up solutions for our organization. The development timeline is significantly longer. Even with an expert, and the throughput is much more throttled in the sense that you have maybe one or two AI engineers that can do the coding, right? And so now it's kind of a force multiplier in the sense that more people can be more comfortable with putting the pieces together versus doing a ground up solution where you have to understand the code. You have to build the FHIR APIs. You have to, still understand the data structure where everything's located in the databases. But the tool sets that the Epic's Agent Factory provides takes a lot of the code work out of it, um, and allows a broader swath of users the ability to kind of put those things together.
All right, very good. We talked about physician builders. Chronicles, we sort of reference Chronicles a little bit and the importance of that. Um, I've done a lot of reading about, different people doing writing about this. Uh, they talk about understanding Chronicles as being absolutely key going forward if you're an Epic shop, obviously. That you must understand where you can have differentiation and personalization or customization in data and where you cannot, where it will be innocuous and where it will break Chronicles. And that, again, working within the Chronicles structure is absolutely critical going forward and may require a lot of remediation work. They call that, uh, going refuel. I forget the term that Epic uses
I
for.
think so, yeah,
Yeah.
refuel.
So, what are your thoughts there? What would you want people to know about the importance of working within the Chronicle structure?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is imperative to kind of stick to the data structure that is there with the EHR. There's some tables are customizable. You can store data different ways, trying to keep a uniform approach so that when you're extracting it, you know that you're getting the data that you think you're getting, right? And we've all probably heard the saying of, crap data in is crap data out. And I think that holds true as well. And it becomes multiplied whenever you have crap data in multiple different silos, right? Where it's you think you're pulling the right thing, but there's also another area in the data structure where that same item is stored, or something like that, right? So you may not be getting the whole picture if you're trying to do a lot of custom work, and storing it into multiple locations, or maybe one piece of data split into two different locations, and then just makes it a little bit more difficult and challenging when getting it out. if you're doing your own custom, build of an agent or of any type of FHIR API, maybe that's not as big of a deal because you can, drill down and if as long as you know where it's located, you can pull it. But with the Agent Factory, release tools, those are basically the code is built into it and it's looking to, field X for this data or field Y for that data. And there's not a lot of user control over where that is pulling from. So you have to make sure that it's stored in the right spot.
All right, very good. Your organization is an Abridge customer, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. This is an interesting dynamic, right? So Epic has now come up with its native functionality, Art for clinicians, Penny for RCM, Emmy for patients. Uh, but they came out with it fairly recently. So a lot of organizations went to third parties. There's Abridge, Nuance, Suki, uh, Nabla, ambient. So there's a whole bunch, and a lot of people jumped in with one of those, and now Epic has come out with its native functionality, which I mentioned. So where does that leave your organization? I mean, a lot of organizations have done this. We talked about this before, where you go with a point solution, perhaps because the native EHR functionality either isn't there or isn't up to what your users wanted, and they pick that niche solution. A lot of CIOs I speak to talk about the dynamic of, okay, we'll go with the point solution, but we're going to keep an eye on the in-house solution until it's up to speed, then we're going to switch. It's a fascinating dynamic, and this is brought to light right now in what's going on. So, not to put you on the spot, but where does that leave you thinking about what you're currently using versus the new Epic in-house functionality?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we've been myself and some small pilot users started with a bridge about a year ago. It was May of 25. To putting my clinician hat on, if somebody tries to take a bridge away from me, I'm going to be very upset because it's that good of a product, in my opinion. But I haven't had a whole lot of opportunity to get hands-on with the art functionality, but I do like, kind of what we were talking about with Agent Factory. They're going to definitely have a leg up in the sense that you get access to the whole data structure and, a bridge is working there. They're partnering with Epic to try to get, I'm sure all the vendors are trying to get the access and get the calls to the different pieces of data throughout the chart to be able to make the note more robust. Yeah, I think, and the other piece that I haven't seen discussed from the art perspective is like the querying out to up to date, querying out to JAMA, New England Journal, like what Abridge AI is doing, and similar to what Open Evidence does as well, right? With all the different training data that all the different data that they're training their models on to try to help provide evidence-based recommendations to clinicians. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how things go. But at the moment we're just kind of watching and waiting and see what happens. But me personally, as a clinician, I'll be sad if I have to give up Bridge.
I believe you wrote a post this morning that I saw where you talk about some issues with this stuff around HIPAA, PHI, and influence, right? And you're trying to
That's
balance all these
yeah.
things. So if you want to just go over that for our
Yeah,
audience a
sure.
little bit
Yeah, no,
about what
I
you wrote.
I watched the keynote from Abridge last week and saw that they're now have investors with Eli Lilly, right? So just me being cynical potentially, but in the back of my mind, it's like, all right, so they're investing because they're planning to get something out of it, right? Some type of ROI. People don't just give money away to give money away. So, are they promoting their products somehow in the background in in the way that the AI CDS is going to work? I would sure hope not. That's always been my pause about open evidence, because whenever a product is free, then that means that you, the user, are the product, right? So either one, they do advertise, they sell ads. It's pretty apparent that there's ads. Again, you hope that it doesn't surface in the recommendations that the AI is giving, but it's not super transparent, or you can't really tell unless you really know the content really, really, really well. But yeah, I mean that's the only thing really. I mean, and again, probably me just being a little bit cynical from the from the
Yeah.
corporation perspective, but I think healthy skepticism is good from that standpoint, at least.
All right, very good. We're almost out of time. Certifications, right? Is this a certification from Epic before you can use this stuff? Agent Factory?
That's what they were alluding to. It's still a work in progress. There'll be like a training, a certification, is my understanding of how they plan to roll it out, to be able to for anybody to build into it, right? So again, there is some controls. It's not just open to anyone and everyone. And then each organization, I think, will have to come up with their own plan of what kind of team that they see, working on this. Is it an isolated, Agent Factory team, or do you cross train people in how to use Agent Factory? And I think that question's still yet to be answered. Um, but whatever the answer is, there's definitely an AI engineer or AI expert that needs to be involved again for the efficiency of the anytime you call a large language model, that efficiency question is going to come into play.
All right, Dr. Dilcher, final question, and then I'm going to let you go. Um, Your thoughts on the CMIO-CIO relationship? A lot of our readers are CIOs. CIOs and CMIOs have some things in common they're trying to accomplish and some differences in what they're trying to accomplish. A CMIO may be obviously very focused on operations, patient care, things like that. A CIO may have a broader IT sort of view where they're trying to watch costs and things like that and infrastructure and keep the lights on and things that maybe you don't have to worry about as much because someone else is supposed to worry about that. What are your thoughts on as a CMIO, what are you looking for from your CIO? What do you think makes a good relationship there? And then what would your advice to your CMIO colleagues on how to be a good CMIO with your CIO and just have a really robust, beneficial relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you talk about leadership positions, communication's key, right? Being able to communicate effectively both directions, honesty, like, hey, that's not a great idea, or, oh, that's a really good idea, let's pursue it. And ultimately, for any organization to be successful, I think pretty much everybody that's in a decision-making role has to be a good steward of finances, right? So even though, yes, the CIO is ultimately responsible for the budget or whatever, but the CMIO should also be thinking, the ACMIO should be thinking about, cost ramifications. The CMIO is kind of similar to what we talked about earlier with, a physician builders that, or the, informaticist is the bridge between the clinical and the technical. It's similar thing, right? The CMIO is kind of the face of IT to the clinicians, to bring back those concerns or questions. Maybe filter some of them out because we all know we get different things from from users that don't quite understand the operations of an IT department
Right.
and IT in general. But yeah, I think again, just harping back to the communication's key, and having that open dialogue and making sure everybody's kind of pulling the rope in the same direction to make the organization successful.
Excellent. Dr. Dilcher, I want to thank you so much for your time today. This was a real pleasure, and I hope we can catch up with you down the road.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Have a great day.
You too.